counseling training program for WIC managers, coordinators, and supervisors. This training has been developed through a cooperative agreement between the USDA Food and Nutrition Service and Every Mother, Inc. It is designed to help state and local agencies implement and sustain successful peer counseling programs that help participants in the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children receive the help they need to reach their breastfeeding goals. The training program for WIC peer counseling program managers, coordinators, and supervisors provides program guidance based on the FNS Loving Support Model, research on the evidence behind peer counseling, best practices adopted by state and local WIC agencies across the country, and solutions to address common challenges. State and local agency showcases are also included to highlight successful strategies. The curriculum is divided into 10 major sections. Each section is important for training new managers and for staff in existing programs to assure continued best practices in program management. Each section has an accompanying notebook and handouts. Feedback from participants during in-person training indicated the notebook was an extremely valuable resource. Both the notebook and handouts are accessible on the Maryland WIC SharePoint website. Please print each notebook section and the handouts prior to viewing the webinars so that you can follow along, take notes, and reference handouts as they are discussed. Welcome to Section 5, Staffing Considerations. Hiring the right people as peer counselors helps assure that the program runs smoothly. This section will address how to find qualified candidates, important qualities to seek, and getting them hired. It will also address common staffing questions of local agencies. At the end of this webinar, WIC managers will be able to list the 3 qualifications of peer counselors as identified in the Loving Support Model. Hiring the right peer counselors helps a program get off to the best start. In this section, we will address important qualities to seek, how to find people with those qualities, and considerations in hiring and employing them. The FNS definition of a peer counselor is detailed in the Loving Support Model. The appropriate definition of a peer counselor is a paraprofessional, recruited and hired from the target population, and representing the same racial, ethnic background as the mothers they support to the extent possible. Available to WIC clients outside usual clinic hours and outside the WIC clinic environment, and previous experience with breastfeeding, having breastfed at least one baby. Peer counselors are women in your community with personal breastfeeding experience who are similar to the population served by your agency and provide information and support to other mothers. They serve as role models for new mothers. See Webinar 2 for the explanation on Bandora's social learning theory for details. FNS funding is specifically allocated for the purpose of paying for peer counselors. State agencies accepting FNS peer counseling funds must agree to the definition of a peer counselor as outlined in the Loving Support Model, which includes paraprofessional, recruited and hired from WIC's target population of WIC-eligible women, available to WIC clients outside the WIC clinic environment, has previous breastfeeding experience. State agencies have the flexibility to develop, implement, or enhance peer counseling programs appropriate to the needs of their local agencies. However, the required components of the Loving Support Model must be included. What is a paraprofessional? Paraprofessionals, as described in the Loving Support Model, are those without extended professional training in health, nutrition, or the clinical management of breastfeeding, who are selected from the group to be served and are trained and given ongoing supervision to provide a basic service or function. Paraprofessionals provide specific tasks within a defined scope of practice. They assist professionals but are not licensed or credentialed as healthcare, nutrition, or lactation consultant professionals. Peer support differs from other forms of lactation support in that the source of support is a peer, a person who is similar in fundamental ways to the recipient of the support. A peer, by virtue of relevant experience, is in a position to offer support and relate to others who are in a similar situation. This unique mother-to-mother support can improve breastfeeding initiation and duration among low-income women. The key is how the participant views the peer counselor. The participant needs to feel that the peer counselor is like her, sharing similar cultural and social characteristics so that appropriate modeling can occur. The loving support model also requires peer counselors to be recruited and hired from WIC's target population of WIC-eligible women. When hiring a new peer counselor, examine the demographics of your local agency. For example, what languages are spoken? Do you serve military families? Try to find peer counselors who feel participants will be able to relate to. Peer counselors who are WIC participants or WIC eligible understand the difficulties faced by low-income mothers and can provide realistic and practical guidance as a result of shared experiences in a way that most health professionals cannot. Some of these experiences may include limited support for breastfeeding at home, a history of work in low-wage jobs that are not supportive of breastfeeding women at work, and might have limited access to resources. A peer counselor who has experienced these issues and overcome them to successfully breastfeed is in a unique position to empower WIC mothers to follow their example. Potential peer counselors who have not been on WIC but are WIC eligible might have faced similar struggles and can be considered a valid and trusted resource for breastfeeding solutions given the unique hardships they have both faced. In some cases, a peer counselor might find she no longer meets WIC income eligibility once she begins receiving compensation as a peer counselor. As a prior WIC participant, she still brings a unique understanding of the WIC world and empathy for WIC participants. The loving support model requires peer counselors to be available to WIC clients outside the WIC clinic environment. Breastfeeding challenges do not always occur during business hours or while a mom is at the WIC clinic. Breastfeeding problems can quickly escalate into much more serious problems. Mothers need to be able to easily access information and support when they need it most, and the peer needs to be available to be that source of information and support. Accessibility involves many facets, including allowing peer counselors to use text messaging, which is often the preferred method of communication among our participants. We will discuss this in more detail in Webinar 7, Practice Settings. Other options, such as being on call at home, were discussed in Webinar 4, Policies and Operations. Research shows that for breastfeeding outcomes to be improved, mothers must be able to access support in a timely manner. Agencies should work with policymakers and staff to explore creative solutions for meeting this requirement. The State Breastfeeding Peer Counselor Coordinator is available to assist local agencies in finding solutions to this issue. The loving support model requires that peer counselors have personal experience with breastfeeding, having breastfed at least one baby. Research shows that the centerpiece of any successful peer counseling program is personal experience in the behavior being promoted. For example, a study on the effectiveness of a peer support initiative at Chicago's Rush Hospital found that the effectiveness of their peer support initiative with NICU mothers was based on having peer role models who themselves had breastfed a preterm NICU infant. Successful breastfeeding peer counselor programs include empathetic peer counselors who have been successful with breastfeeding and have themselves been low income to help mothers similar to them gain confidence in their ability to breastfeed. The Phase 2 WIC breastfeeding peer counseling study found that all of the WIC agencies in the studies recommend or require their peer counselors to have current or previous breastfeeding experience. Formative research conducted to establish the peer counseling program in 2004 found that most programs require peer counselors to have breastfed their baby a minimum of 6 months to enhance their ability to better model continued breastfeeding. Some agencies also seek peer counselors who have exclusively breastfed for 6 months so that the peer counselor can authentically serve as a role model for how other WIC mothers can achieve the recommendations of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Revisit Section 2, Peer Counseling, How and Why It Makes a Difference for WIC Families for more research studies on the importance of personal breastfeeding experience for peer counselors. Peer counseling has been shown to help increase breastfeeding rates among vulnerable population groups least likely to breastfeed. Lower breastfeeding rates are associated with poor health outcomes among infants, leading to higher infant mortality rates. Current CDC data shows racial disparities in infant mortality rates. Per 1,000 births, there are 11.3 deaths among Black infants versus 4.9 and 5.0 among white and Hispanic infants, respectively. Increasing support for vulnerable population groups can help create a culture of support to reduce disparities. Breastfeeding rates are significantly lower among African American women than any other ethnic group in the United States. Current CDC data reports an 81.5% initiation rate among white mothers versus a 64.3% initiation rate among Black mothers. Peer counseling has been shown to be an effective intervention in improving breastfeeding rates in African American populations. To achieve outcomes that address disparities in the population, WIC agencies should consider hiring peer counselors who represent the same culture as WIC mothers. Studies have shown that infant feeding decisions are often made within the context of much broader contextual factors, including social, cultural, and historical perspectives. Peer counseling by women who are part of the culture and the community can be an effective intervention to increase breastfeeding rates as part of a comprehensive program of support. Agencies should consider hiring peer counselors who speak the same language as WIC mothers served. The primary focus of a peer counselor's role is being able to communicate with participants. Mothers must be able to feel confident that they can communicate effectively with their peer counselor by speaking the same language. While translators and language helplines can assist, a peer counselor from the same culture and language can convey accurate information and relate to the mother. Peer counselors should also have an enthusiasm for breastfeeding. Many agencies believe that if a woman is enthusiastic about breastfeeding, she can be taught what she needs to know to function well as a peer counselor. Finally, peer counselors need confident communication skills. Because a peer counselor's primary job is talking with other mothers, it is important for them to be able to clearly articulate information and be understood. Although counseling skills can be learned, a basic ability to confidently promote breastfeeding goes a long way toward preparing a peer counselor for her job. Some local agencies have faced situations where they are challenged when they recruit and hire their peer counselors. Males are valuable members of breastfeeding promotion and support programs. Programs such as the Texas Peer Dad program has been shown to significantly increase breastfeeding rates among WIC participants. However, these programs are beyond the scope of the Loving Support peer counselor funding and should be paid for through NSA funding or other sources. Should agencies have questions about hiring practices that selectively target women, it should be noted that the definition of a peer counselor is someone who shares characteristics of the population served. The WIC program only serves women, infants, and children. WIC peer counselors must share the characteristics of WIC participants to be considered a peer. Peer counselors are often in a position of viewing a mother's bare breasts to assist with positioning and latch, and potentially to identify breastfeeding problems. Agency personnel departments or HR directors with concerns about limiting peer counselor hires to women can address the issue with their agency legal staff to determine appropriate language to be used when hiring peer counselors who meet the FNS definition. Ideally, WIC agencies should select peer counselors similar in age to those of the participants being served by WIC. Some programs have successfully retained peer counselors for many years until they are technically no longer considered a true peer. Often, the peer counselors themselves feel like they are no longer like the mothers they serve. However, they remain passionate about supporting families and can continue to be very effective. Some programs happily retain these peer counselors and seek to hire younger mothers who represent the target population when additional job openings appear. Some programs allow experienced, long-term peer counselors to take on added areas of responsibility to value their knowledge and expertise with the program. Some peer counselors serve as senior peer counselors, teaching classes and mentoring and supervising other peer counselors. Some continue their education, become IBCLCs, and transition to the role of designated breastfeeding expert for the agency. Lactation consultants and other health professionals are critical members of the healthcare team in supporting new mothers. However, they do not meet the definition of a paraprofessional in the Loving Support model. These professionals provide high-level support that breastfeeding mothers need and often handle complex breastfeeding challenges. They receive referrals from peer counselors, and they provide breastfeeding training for peer counselors and WIC staff. They may also manage the peer counseling program and supervise peer counselors. Hiring a lactation consultant is an allowable expense for peer counseling funds. And it is an important point to note that funds must primarily focus on paying for peer counselors. Some peer counselors find their passion as breastfeeding support and ultimately become certified as international board-certified lactation consultants. If a peer counselor becomes certified and starts functioning as an IBCLC, she is a healthcare professional and can no longer be considered a peer counselor. The local agency has various options to consider. The new IBCLC can be moved into a different position within the program and paid a salary appropriate for that position given the additional expertise her credential represents. She would operate under her IBCLC scope of practice to receive referrals from peer counselors and other WIC staff to manage complex breastfeeding challenges. She could move into program management, such as a peer counseling coordinator, breastfeeding coordinator, trainer, peer counselor supervisor, or other position providing program management responsibilities. If there are no positions available to accommodate the new IBCLC, some may leave the program to work for a local hospital or other entity that provides them opportunities to function in their new role. Asking a peer counselor with the IBCLC credential to continue working as a peer counselor can set up a difficult management scenario for state and local agencies and is discouraged by FNS. It can be demoralizing for a peer counselor who has attained a higher level of expertise to stay within the scope of practice of a peer counselor and continue receiving a lower rate of pay. This can lead to job dissatisfaction and turnover. It is equally hard for agencies to monitor this. Agencies should establish realistic expectations with peer counselors who express an interest in expanding their clinical skills. They should always be encouraged to grow their knowledge and skills with realistic expectations about whether positions will be available. Where do most agencies find potential peer counselors? The population of WIC breastfeeding mothers is a great place to start. Many of our local agencies run WOW reports of breastfeeding participants to identify potential peer counselors. Ask local agency staff for recommendations. They may know some moms who are very enthusiastic about breastfeeding and are interested in helping other moms. Sometimes it is necessary to look outside of WIC and consider community sources. Talk to your staff who are active on social media. Have they identified friends or colleagues they feel could be a potential peer counselor? Community organizations that serve a similar population as WIC may have participants who are potential peers. Local healthcare providers, such as hospital lactation consultants or pediatric providers, can be another avenue to explore. Healthcare providers may be familiar with breastfeeding mothers they feel could be a good candidate for a peer counselor position. Hospital mothers groups or La Leche League groups often attract passionate breastfeeding moms, and outreach to these groups builds the network of community support for breastfeeding in your area. Confidentiality rules may prohibit you from receiving contact information directly from other healthcare providers. In this case, you could ask providers to share your contact information with mothers they feel might be interested. There are no rules for the number of peer counselors a program needs at any one time. The number depends on many factors, including available budget, the number of WIC clients served, numbers of women breastfeeding, community demographics, and job duties of the peer counselors. Using a formula similar to the one the Missouri WIC program used, the state breastfeeding peer counselor coordinator calculated the number of peer counselors each Maryland WIC agency should ideally have. We used the estimate of 20 minutes per contact. This is for peer counselors who are primarily making phone calls or making in-person clinic contacts. We added the number of pregnant, breastfeeding exclusive, breastfeeding mostly, and breastfeeding some women in each agency. We divided that number by 3 for number of contacts per hour to find the number of peer counselor hours needed. We divided that number again by 160, as this is the equivalent to a full-time person, or FTE, working 40 hours per week, 4 weeks per month. These calculations were shared with each local agency coordinator and peer counselor coordinator. Please keep in mind these are estimates and give us a general idea of about how many peer counselors your agency needs. Please contact the State Breastfeeding Peer Counselor Program Coordinator to discuss the results of these calculations. Some local agencies will want to factor in activities that require more time. This may include hospital visits and assisting with classes and support groups. Keep in mind that contacts with new mothers are variable depending on the extent of a mother's questions and concerns. It is difficult to identify hard and fast rules. The numbers provided are a general estimate, just as the times provided here are general estimates. Telephone contacts, including time for documentation, allow for approximately 3 to 5 calls per hour. Clinic visits, including time for documentation, allow around 20 to 30 minutes per visit. Hospital visits allow around 1 hour per 1 to 2 visits, depending on the extent of help the peer is providing. Classes and support group meetings allow around 2 hours, 1 hour class plus preparation and class setup. In general, a new program should start small. As the program grows and as peer counselors grow in their counseling skills, they will become more efficient at handling larger numbers of participants. As the program grows, you will more than likely have more breastfeeding women. You may need to consider hiring more peer counselors or increasing their hours to accommodate the growing need. This is the hope for all of our local agencies: more breastfeeding women and more breastfeeding peer counselor services provided. This concludes Section 5, Staffing Considerations. Please continue on to Section 6, Scope of Practice.